In 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, combat is actually a pretty big part of the game, and if your combat is boring or not as fun as it could be, that could really detrimentally affect the game. Which is why I'm going to go through 5 ways that I managed to improve my own combat, and hopefully you can take the tips from them and improve your own. And some of these are going to be tips that are really easy to implement and you can implement them right away, while others might take a bit of work while you improve on your skills, but eventually it will be more than worth it when your combat is amazing. So let's jump into the first way to improve your combat, and this is one that you can implement right away, and that's by making your enemies talk. Now this obviously only works if they are creatures with intelligence and with language. If you have like a boule, for example, it's not going to talk. But if your players are fighting something like orcs or other humanoids, put some talking in there while they're fighting. And there's a few ways you can do this. You can make the bad guys talk to each other, or you can make the bad guys talk to the players. Give them a little bit of trash talk. And this is really going to make the combat encounter much more interesting. I still remember the first time I had one of the enemies shout, "That one there, that's the healer, get them first." And my players' faces as they realised, oh, these are intelligent and know what they're doing, we have to up our game. As well as that, you can just make them trash talk the players. If they miss, for example, just make a bit of fun out of them. That is a lot of fun. And it's a way for you as a DM to get a bit of payback for something they did earlier. And then the other way you can implement this is if your player does end up killing one of these enemies, have them say something as they die that makes them feel a bit more real. Have them as they're falling to the ground, shout to one of their allies, "Tell Sandra, I always love her." And then your players will just realise these are real people that they are killing, and maybe they shouldn't have killed them, maybe they should have spoken first. So there you go, there's the first tip. Let's move on to the second one, and this is one that quite a lot of people talk about, and that's using the environment. But this is something you can put in right away, you just have to put it in the planning phase. So while you're planning an encounter before you actually go ahead and play it, make sure that there are some environmental factors involved. So if they're fighting in the streets, maybe have some of the bad guys up on the roofs to give it a bit of elevation. Maybe have them knock over something to make a bit of difficult terrain down on the ground level. Or if they're in the Underdark, for example, there could be plants that let off spores that do something in the middle of combat. There's quite a few different ways that you can involve the environment in your combat encounters, and nowadays I make sure that there are environmental factors in every single one of my encounters. And that could be as little as what I've already spoken about, or maybe they're in a mountain and there is actually a sheer cliff drop and the enemies are trying to push the players off of that cliff. Now the stakes are a lot higher, and the environmental factors could also have been put in place by the enemies beforehand. So imagine the players are going into a kobold cave, and as a trap is released, all of the kobolds will rush the players. Now the players have to take part in the combat while they're trying to dodge swinging blades, for example. It just makes it a much more interesting combat encounter than just hitting kobolds. And then the last thing I want to say about the environment is maybe the environment is actually what the encounter is. So for example, if it's a boss battle, maybe they're not actually supposed to be hitting and trying to kill the boss, they have to turn off some gems. So the encounter turns from just trying to hit this guy until he dies, to now running around a cave and trying to turn off gems. And as you can imagine, that makes for a much more interesting encounter than just everyone trying to hit a singular bad guy. So now we got the environmental factors out of the way, the other way you can improve your combat is by having interesting enemies. If you take the stat block of an orc, for example, there's not really much there which is interesting, and this is fine for low levels, especially if they're new players, to teach them how combat works. But if you compare that to something like a rust monster that has some sort of effect which is a lot more interesting, you can see how that encounter would be more interesting to your players. So just think about what enemies you're going to use and maybe try to put some more interesting enemies in there rather than just the basic ones. Or alternatively, you can change the basic ones to have a little bit of an interesting edge. So using the orcs for the example again, now in the other books such as Volo Guides, there are other types of orcs which are a bit more interesting than the standard one that you get in the monster manual. So you don't have to change the entire encounter to a different monster because you think orcs are boring, for example. You can just change orcs to make them a little bit more enjoyable. Right, so the 3 points I've gone through so far are stuff that you can pretty much implement right away, and these last 2 are going to take some getting used to and some improving on your skills. And the first of which is making sure that you are describing what is happening in the combat encounter. At the moment, your combat encounters might just be as simple as saying what is rolled, DM saying if it hits, saying what damage is rolled, and a DM saying yep, and then removing that from the hit points. But really, if you want to make it a lot more engaging, you need to be describing what is happening, or you need to be getting the players to describe what is happening. You will find some players don't want to do that though, so you as a DM are just going to have to pick up the slack and do it yourself. So for example, if the player says it's a 19 to hit, you can say, yes, as you swing your blade, you manage to hit it straight in the midsection as crimson blood sprays all over your shield. And then the player will say that's for 9 damage, and you as a DM can say, the orc cries out in pain, but he manages to stand and fight because he doesn't want to let down his master. Now that's a lot more engaging than if you just said, it's this to hit, yes that hits, it's this damage, okay cool, on to the next person. And as you do this, you are going to get better and better, and there's loads of live streams out there of people who are amazing at this, so you can go and get a little bit of inspiration from them. When I decided I wanted to get better at descriptions in combat, I would keep a few keywords behind the DM screen, and then if I was struggling to describe something, I could just look down to them and it would give me some inspiration so I could do some better descriptions. So give that a go, see how you get on, but I promise as you do it more and more, you will just get better. And then the final thing you can do to improve your combat is make sure the players do actually have a stake in the combat. So this could be just making the stakes high, i.e. it's a tough combat, so you have to be engaged and be getting involved or you're all going to die. You've probably already noticed that if one of the players does get knocked unconscious, the whole table gets much more engaged with what's going on, so making the stakes just a bit higher helps with this. But that's not the only way to use stakes to make it more engaging. It could be that they're there to get an artifact, for example, and they see the artifact on a character that is trying to run away. So now rather than it being a hard encounter because they think they're going to die, it's a harder encounter because they have to now chase that person and make sure that artifact doesn't get away. So there's a few ways you can use stakes, and I think the hardest way, which sort of comes into storytelling as well, is making them actually care about the combat. So what I mean by that is if an NPC that they love has been stolen by a group, they're going to care much more about going to that group, taking them down and getting their NPC friend back. Whereas if the encounter is just some noble has hired them to go and clear out a cave, it is going to be a lot less engaging because they don't really care about the combat, they're just there to do a job and because D&D says so. So you can use storytelling and the reason why the players are actually fighting there to make the combat much more exciting. So there you go, there are the 5 tips that I want to give you to improve your combat encounters. They definitely helped me over the years, and I would say now I'm pretty good at running combat encounters. If you want more tips like this, make sure to subscribe, and if you did find value out of this video, make sure to give it a like. If you want to continue improving your game, make sure to click this video here. It's going to give you some more value and some more tips of how you can go ahead and improve your game.